lonely rancher found a baby. But the sheriff claimed it was his bloodline. Samuel Hartwell had been alone so long, he'd forgotten what his own voice sounded like, until he found a crying baby in the ashes of a burned wagon, and the sheriff rode up claiming she was his blood. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in what family really means. The sun was dying when Samuel Hartwell heard the crying. He had been riding the fence line of his northern pasture, checking for breaks in the wire that divided his land from the endless stretch of desert beyond. The sound came thin and high across the mesa, carried on the evening wind like a memory of something he'd lost long ago. Samuel pulled his horse to a stop and listened. The crying came again, desperate and raw. 20 yards ahead, the skeleton of a wagon sat blackened against the orange sky. The canvas top had burned away to nothing, leaving only the wooden ribs reaching up like the bones of some great beast. Scattered around it were the remains of a life interrupted, a broken mirror catching the last light, a child's wooden toy horse lying on its side, a woman's shoe with the heel torn away. Samuel climbed down from his horse and walked toward the sound. His boots crunched on glass and ash. The smell of old smoke still clung to the air, mixed with something else, something that made his stomach turn. Behind the wagon, wrapped in what had once been a calico dress, was a baby. She couldn't have been more than a few months old. Her face was red from crying, her tiny fists waving at the darkening sky. The dress that covered her was torn and stained, but clean enough to tell him someone had cared for her, at least for a while. Someone who was nowhere to be seen now. Samuel knelt in the dust and picked her up. She was so light, so fragile, that for a moment he was afraid he might break her just by holding her. The baby looked up at him with eyes the color of sage, and her crying stopped. They stared at each other in the fading light, two souls who had found each other in the middle of nothing. "Where's your mama, little one?" Samuel whispered. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty from years of speaking only to horses and cattle. He looked around the wreckage again, but he already knew what he wouldn't find. If there had been anyone else here, they were gone now. The buzzards circling overhead told him that much. The desert had claimed whatever story this wagon held, and left him only with its ending. Samuel had been alone on his ranch for 5 years, ever since his wife Mary died of the fever. 5 years of silence, so deep it had settled into his bones like cold. 5 years of talking to his animals and getting only snorts and whinnies in return. 5 years of eating meals that tasted like dust and sleeping in a bed that felt big enough to swallow him whole. Now, holding this child against his chest, he felt something crack open inside him. Something he'd thought the desert had burned out of him forever. The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, but not quite a coo. Samuel found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I guess you're coming home with me," he said softly. "Can't leave you out here for the coyotes." He wrapped her more carefully in the calico dress and carried her to his horse. The animal snorted and shifted, sensing something different about its rider. Samuel mounted up carefully, holding the baby close to his chest with one arm while he guided the horse with the other. As they rode back toward his ranch, the stars began to appear overhead, distant and cold, but somehow reassuring. Samuel looked down at the child in his arms and made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. "Grace," he said aloud, testing the name on his tongue. "I'll call you Grace, after the only prayer I remember my mama teaching me." The baby's eyes were already growing heavy with sleep. Samuel felt her small body relax against him, trusting him in a way that made his chest tight with something he couldn't name. It had been so long since anyone had needed him for anything more than fixing fence posts and herding cattle. His ranch appeared ahead of them, a low adobe house with a barn and corral that looked small and lonely under the vast sky. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, Samuel didn't see loneliness when he looked at it. He saw home. He carried Grace inside and stood in his kitchen, suddenly uncertain. He had no idea how to care for a baby. Mary had wanted children, but they'd never been blessed that way. Now, holding this little girl, he wondered if maybe the desert hadn't taken something from him after all. Maybe it had finally decided to give something back. Samuel heated some milk on his wood stove and, dipped a clean rag in it, letting Grace suck on it until she fell asleep in his arms. He sat in his old rocking chair by the fireplace, watching the flames dance across her peaceful face, and for the first time in years, the silence in his house didn't feel like a weight trying to crush him. It felt like possibility. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and stirring the dust. But Samuel barely heard it. He was too busy listening to the soft sound of Grace's breathing, too busy marveling at how such a small thing could make his empty house feel so full. He didn't know then that the desert's gift would come with a price. He didn't know that Sheriff Marcus Donovan was already riding hard across the territory, following a trail that would lead him straight to Samuel's door. He didn't know that the baby sleeping so peacefully in his arms carried secrets in her blood that would test everything he thought he knew about love and family. All Samuel knew was that the crying had stopped, and for the first time in 5 long years, he wasn't alone. But in the desert, gifts and curses often wore the same face, and the morning would bring questions that the silence couldn't answer. For 3 months, Samuel Hartwell thought he'd been blessed by the desert, until the sheriff rode up to his door and claimed the baby he'd learned to love wasn't his to keep. 3 months passed like whispered prayers. Samuel learned things he'd never thought his rough hands could master. How to warm milk just enough that it wouldn't burn Grace's tongue. How to change her clothes without fumbling with the tiny buttons. How to sing lullabies in a voice that had grown rusty from years of silence. Old songs his mother had sung to him when the world was smaller and made more sense. Grace grew like a wildflower after rain. Her sage-colored eyes followed him around the kitchen as he made his coffee in the mornings. She smiled when he talked to her, as if she understood every word, and she'd learned to sleep through the night without crying. Samuel found himself looking forward to sunrise for the first time in years, eager to see what new thing she might do. He built her a cradle from mesquite wood, sanding it smooth with his own hands until it gleamed like honey in the lamplight. He carved tiny horses along the sides, remembering how she'd reached for that wooden toy horse in the wagon wreckage. At night, he'd rock her to sleep and tell her stories about the ranch, about the cattle and the horses, about the way the desert looked when the sun painted it gold. The loneliness that had lived in his house like a cold ghost finally packed up and left. But the desert never gave anything without asking for something in return. Sheriff Marcus Donovan arrived on a Tuesday morning when the autumn wind was just starting to bite. Samuel was teaching Grace to clap her hands together, laughing at the serious expression on her face as she concentrated, when he heard the sound of hooves on his front path. Through the window, he saw a man riding hard, his horse lathered with sweat and breathing hard. The rider wore a silver badge that caught the morning sun like a warning. Samuel's stomach dropped the way it used to when he was a boy and heard his father's angry voice calling his name. Sheriff Donovan was a tall man with iron-gray hair and eyes like winter sky. He dismounted and tied his horse to Samuel's porch rail, then stood for a moment looking at the house as if he were measuring it for a coffin. Samuel opened the door before the sheriff could knock. Grace balanced on his hip. "Morning, Sheriff," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Long ride out here from town." Donovan's eyes went straight to the baby. Something shifted in his face like a door slamming shut. "Samuel Hartwell?" "That's right. I'm here about the child." The words hit Samuel like a punch to the chest. He shifted Grace higher on his hip, feeling suddenly protective. "What about her?" "Her name's not for you to decide." The sheriff's voice was flat and hard. "That baby belongs to my bloodline. She's my granddaughter." Samuel felt the world tilt sideways. "You're what?" "My daughter Rebecca ran off 3 months ago, pregnant and unmarried, bringing shame on my name." Donovan's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. Word came back that her wagon was attacked by raiders up near Devil's Canyon. "Found a wreckage myself yesterday. Found blood, but no bodies. Rebecca's dead?" Samuel's voice came out smaller than he intended. "Most likely, but the child lives." Donovan nodded toward Grace, who had gone very still in Samuel's arms, as if she could sense the danger in the air. "She has my daughter's eyes, my late wife's nose. She's family, Hartwell. Bloodkin." Samuel looked down at Grace, seeing her with new eyes. Now that Donovan mentioned it, he could see the resemblance. The way her mouth curved when she smiled. The stubborn set of her chin when she was hungry. She was dying when I found her, Samuel said quietly. Wrapped in rags, crying in the desert. No one else around for miles. And I'm grateful for that. Truly. But Donovan's voice didn't sound grateful. It sounded like a man trying to convince himself of something. But gratitude doesn't change blood. She's my kin, and she belongs with me. Samuel's arms tightened around Grace instinctively. She made a small sound and reached up to touch his face with her tiny fingers, the way she always did when she wanted comfort. She doesn't know you, Samuel said. She'll learn. Children adapt. You don't know the first thing about caring for a baby. I raised my daughter well enough. Donovan's voice turned sharp, at least until she decided to disgrace herself and run off with some drifter. The harshness in the sheriff's voice made Grace whimper. Samuel found himself swaying slightly, the way he always did when she was upset, and she quieted against his chest. Donovan noticed. His eyes narrowed. You've gotten attached, he said. It wasn't a question. Samuel didn't answer. How could he explain what the last 3 months had meant to him? How Grace's laughter had filled the empty corners of his house. How her small presence had reminded him what it felt like to have something worth protecting. She's all the family I got left, Donovan continued. My wife's been dead 10 years. My daughter's gone. This child is the only piece of Rebecca I have left in this world. Samuel heard the pain underneath the sheriff's hard words, and it made his chest ache. He understood loss. He understood the desperate need to hold on to something, anything, that connected you to the people you'd loved. But Grace chose that moment to laugh, a bright sound like water over stones. She clapped her hands the way Samuel had taught her, proud of herself, and looked up at him with complete trust and love. I can see she's fond of you, Donovan said, and for the first time his voice softened just a little. But fondness ain't the same as family. Blood runs deeper than kindness, Hartwell. Samuel wanted to argue, wanted to fight, wanted to tell the sheriff that he'd earned the right to keep Grace through 3 months of sleepless nights and worry days. But the law was the law, even out here, where it sometimes felt like the only rules were the ones written by wind and dust. When? Samuel asked. I'll be back tomorrow morning. Have her ready. Donovan untied his horse and mounted up, then looked down at Samuel with something that might have been sympathy. You did a good thing, keeping her alive. I won't forget that. Then he rode away, leaving Samuel standing on his porch with Grace in his arms and the taste of coming lost bitter in his mouth. That night, Samuel sat in his rocking chair by the fire, holding Grace while she slept. He memorized the weight of her in his arms, the way her hair curled against his chest, the small sound she made in her dreams. He tried to imagine his house without her, but his mind wouldn't hold the picture. It was like trying to imagine the desert without sand. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and moaning around the corners of the house. It sounded like grief, like all the loneliness Samuel had thought he'd left behind. Tomorrow, he would lose the only family he'd known in 5 years. Tomorrow, Grace would become a stranger's burden instead of his joy. But tonight, she was still his. Tonight, he could still pretend that the desert's gift hadn't come with a price too high to pay. In her sleep, Grace's tiny hand curled around his finger, holding on tight. Samuel closed his eyes and wondered if she would remember him, or if he would become just another ghost haunting the edges of her dreams. The fire burned low, and the silence crept back into the corners of the room, patient and hungry, waiting to reclaim its territory. Samuel thought he was losing Grace forever, until he saw the sheriff's hand shake when he held her and realized they were both prisoners of the same terrible truth. Sheriff Donovan returned at sunrise, but he didn't take Grace. Samuel had spent the night pacing his kitchen, Grace sleeping peacefully in her cradle while he rehearsed a dozen different arguments in his head. He'd prepared a bag of her clothes, the wooden horses he'd carved, the soft blanket Mary had made years ago that Grace had claimed as her own. Everything a child might need to start a new life with a stranger. But when Donovan knocked, Samuel opened the door to find a man who looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "She ready?" the sheriff asked, but his voice lacked the hard certainty it had carried the day before. Samuel nodded toward the bag by the door. "Everything she'll need." Donovan stared at the bag for a long moment, then at Grace, who was babbling happily in Samuel's arms, completely unaware that her world was about to change forever. "Mind if I hold her for a minute?" Donovan asked. "Before we go." Samuel hesitated, then carefully transferred Grace into the sheriff's arms. The moment Donovan took her weight, his hands began to shake. Not much, but enough for Samuel to notice. Grace looked up at this new face with curious eyes, then reached out and grabbed the sheriff's finger. Donovan went very still. "She's got Rebecca's hands," he whispered. "Same long fingers. Rebecca used to grab my finger just like this when she was small." Grace made one of her happy, gurgling sounds, and Donovan's face crumpled like paper. "I don't know how," he said, so quietly Samuel almost didn't hear him. "I don't know how to do this." Samuel studied the sheriff's face and saw something there he recognized. The same desperate fear he'd felt that first night when Grace had cried and he'd had no idea how to comfort her. "Come inside," Samuel said. "We need to talk." They sat at Samuel's kitchen table while Grace played on a blanket between them, content and oblivious. Donovan held a cup of coffee in both hands like he was trying to warm something deep inside himself that had gone cold. "Tell me about Rebecca," Samuel said. Donovan was quiet for so long that Samuel thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, the word began to come. "She was headstrong from the day she could walk. Smart as a whip, stubborn as a mule. After her mother died, it was just the two of us. I tried to raise her right, but..." He shook his head. "I was too hard on her, too worried about what people would think if the sheriff's daughter stepped out of line." Grace rolled over and grabbed her wooden horse, gnawing on its ears. Both men watched her with the careful attention of people trying to memorize something precious. "When she started keeping company with that drifter, I forbade it," Donovan continued. "Said no daughter of mine would be seen with a man who had no name, no family, no prospects. We fought something fierce about it. But she loved him? Must have. She ran off with him in the middle of the night, left me a letter saying she was sorry, but she couldn't live under my judgment anymore." Donovan's voice turned bitter. "Last words she ever said to me were spoken in anger." Samuel poured more coffee, giving the sheriff time to collect himself. Outside, the wind was picking up, stirring the dust and rattling the windows the way it always did when a storm was coming. "Found out she was pregnant from Mrs. Henderson at the general store," Donovan went on. "Word travels fast in a small town. I was so angry, so ashamed, I didn't even try to find her. Figured she'd made her bed. She could lie in it." Grace dropped her toy horse and started a fuss. Without thinking, Samuel reached over and picked her up, settling her on his knee. She immediately calmed, resting her head against his chest with the complete trust of a child who'd never known anything but safety. Donovan watched this exchange with something like wonder in his eyes. "She knows you," he said. "Really knows you. The way Rebecca used to know her mother. 3 months is a long time in a baby's life." "Yeah." Donovan rubbed his face with both hands. "I keep thinking about what Rebecca would say if she could see me now, coming to claim her daughter after I drove her away." Grace had fallen asleep against Samuel's chest, her small fist curled in his shirt. The sight of her peaceful face seemed to settle something in both men. "What was Rebecca like as a child?" Samuel asked. A ghost of a smile crossed Donovan's weathered face. "Fearless. She'd climb any tree, ride any horse, ask more questions than a body could answer. Used to follow me around when I was working, wanting to help with everything. Call me Papa until she was old enough to be embarrassed by it. She sounds like she was a good daughter. She was. Until I convinced her she wasn't." Donovan's voice broke just a little. "I was so worried about protecting her reputation, I forgot to protect her heart." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Grace slept on, her breathing soft and even. The storm that had been building finally broke, sending fat raindrops against the windows and filling the air with the smell of wet earth. "I don't know the first thing about caring for a baby," Donovan said finally. "Haven't held one since Rebecca was small. My hands are too rough, my voice too loud. I'd probably drop her or scare her or do something to hurt her without meaning to." Samuel looked at this proud man who'd been brought low by grief and recognized something of himself in Donovan's fear. "I didn't know either when I found her," Samuel said quietly. "Had to learn as I went. Made plenty of mistakes. But you figured it out. Had to. She needed me, too." Donovan nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a shared breath. "She needs you now," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. "More than she needs me. But you're her blood family. Her grandfather. Blood doesn't mean much if you don't know how to love properly." Donovan stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the rain. "I failed Rebecca. I won't fail her daughter the same way." Grace stirred in Samuel's arms but didn't wake. She simply settled deeper into sleep, completely secure in his embrace. "What are you saying?" Samuel asked. Donovan turned back from the window, and Samuel saw a decision forming in the sheriff's eyes. A decision that looked like it was tearing him apart and putting him back together at the same time. "I'm saying maybe there's more than one way to be family," Donovan said. "Maybe blood isn't the only thing that matters." The rain drummed harder against the roof, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the desert like the voice of God changing his mind about something important. Outside, the storm raged on, washing the dust from the world and leaving everything clean and new. Inside, two men sat in the lamplight with a sleeping child between them, both learning what it meant to love something more than their own pride. The desert had taught them its hardest lesson. Sometimes the only way to keep something precious was to learn how to share it. Two broken men, one precious child, and a decision that would redefine what family really means under the endless desert sky. The first snow fell on Christmas Eve, 3 months after Sheriff Donovan chose to stay. Samuel watched from his kitchen window as fat flakes drifted down like pieces of heaven, covering the sharp edges of the mesa in soft white silence. Behind him, Grace sat in her high chair, trying to catch the spoonful of mashed sweet potato that Donovan was patiently offering her. She was 10 months old now, sitting up strong and babbling words that almost made sense. "Come on, little darling," Donovan coaxed, his voice gentle in a way Samuel never would have imagined that first day. "Just one more bite for your Papa Marcus." Papa Marcus. The name had stuck after Grace first said it, clear as a church bell 2 weeks earlier. Samuel had worried it might sting, hearing her call another man Papa, but instead it had filled him with something warm and proud. She called him Papa Sam, and somehow there was room in her small heart for both of them. Grace opened her mouth like a baby bird and accepted the sweet potato, then clapped her hands in delight. Orange mush splattered everywhere, including Donovan's badge, which he'd learned to remove before feeding time. "She's got more on her face than in her belly," Samuel said, bringing over a warm washcloth. "Reminds me of Rebecca at this age." Donovan wiped Grace's chin with infinite patience. That girl could make a mess eating water. It had taken time for them to find their rhythm. These two stubborn men learning to share the space that had once belonged to Samuel's loneliness. The first month had been awkward, full of careful politeness and unspoken boundaries. Donovan had slept in the barn, insisting he didn't want to impose, while Samuel had hovered nervously whenever the sheriff handled Grace. But Grace herself had solved their problem, the way children often do. She loved them both with the uncomplicated honesty that only babies possess, and slowly, watching her joy at having two devoted caretakers, Samuel and Donovan had stopped competing and started cooperating. Now, Donovan had his own room, built onto the side of the house with timber they'd hauled from the mountains together. They took turns with the night feedings, shared the cooking duties, and argued good-naturedly about everything from how to train the horses to whether Grace was ready for solid food. Samuel had never expected to find friendship with a man like Marcus Donovan, but grief and love had a way of breaking down walls that pride had built too high. "Think the snow will stick?" Donovan asked, lifting Grace from her high chair and settling her on his lap. Might. It's been cold enough. Samuel poured coffee for both of them, a ritual they perfected over months of morning conversations. Grace's first snow. They both looked at her with the wonder of men who'd forgotten how to see the world through fresh eyes until a child reminded them. Grace was staring out the window at the falling flakes, her mouth open in amazement, her hands reaching towards something she couldn't quite touch. Want to take her outside? Donovan suggested. Let her feel it. Samuel bundled Grace in the warm coat he'd bought from the traveling merchant, complete with a tiny hood that made her look like a worried owl. They carried her onto the front porch, where she could watch the snow fall without getting too cold. The desert looked transformed under its white blanket, peaceful and clean. The harsh lines of rocks and ravines had softened into gentle curves, and even the stubborn sagebrush wore caps of snow like Sunday hats. Grace reached out her mittened hand and caught a snowflake. It melted instantly against the wool, but she laughed with pure delight at the magic of it. First of many, Samuel said softly. God willing, Donovan agreed. They stood there in comfortable silence, three souls who'd found each other in the most unlikely way. Samuel thought about the night he'd found Grace crying in the wagon wreckage, how desperate and alone he'd felt. He'd thought he was saving her, but maybe she'd been saving him all along. Marcus, Samuel said, using the sheriff's first name the way he'd learned to do when they were just being family instead of acquaintances. I need to ask you something. Ask away. When you decided to stay, to share this with me, what made you choose that? Donovan adjusted Grace's hood, his weathered hands gentle against her small face. Rebecca wrote me a letter once, after she'd been gone about a month. I found it in my desk drawer last week, forgot I'd saved it. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket, worn soft from handling. She said she hoped someday I'd learn that love isn't about owning somebody. It's about wanting what's best for them, even if that means letting go of what you thought you needed. Samuel felt his throat tighten. Sounds like she was wise. Wiser than her old man, that's certain. Donovan's voice was thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. I spent so many years trying to protect her by controlling her. I forgot to just love her. When I saw how Grace looked at you, how happy and safe she was, I realized I had a choice. I could make the same mistake twice, or I could try to honor my daughter's memory by doing better. Grace had fallen asleep against Donovan's chest, lulled by the soft sound of falling snow and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Samuel reached over and touched her small hand, marveling as always at the perfect completeness of her tiny fingers. She will be proud of you, Samuel said. Rebecca, I mean. Proud of the grandfather you've become. I hope so. I surely hope so. The snow fell harder, creating a white curtain around the porch that made the whole world feel hushed and sacred. Samuel could hear his cattle lowing softly in the distance, settling in for the night, and somewhere an owl called out across the mesa. I've been thinking, Donovan said carefully, about making this arrangement more official. Samuel raised an eyebrow. How do you mean? Well, far as the law is concerned, Grace is still my kin. But that doesn't mean she can't be yours too. I could draw up papers, make your legal guardian alongside me. Make sure she's provided for no matter what happens to either of us. Samuel felt something warm spread through his chest, like sunrise after the longest night. You do that. Already talked to Judge Morrison about it. Says it's unusual, but not impossible. 2 guardians for 1 child, both with equal rights and responsibilities. Grace stirred in her sleep, making the small humming sound she always made when she was dreaming. Both men looked down at her with the fierce protectiveness of fathers, biological or otherwise. There's something else, Donovan said. I've been thinking about retiring for sheriffing. Maybe staying out here permanent-like, helping you run the ranch. If you'd have me. Samuel looked at this man who'd become his unlikely partner in the hardest and most rewarding job in the world, raising a child. I like that, Marcus. I like that very much. The snow continued to fall, and Samuel thought about how different this Christmas Eve was from the one a year ago, when he'd sat alone in his empty house, counting his failures instead of his blessings. Now his house was full of voices and laughter, of Grace's babbling and Donovan's off-key humming and the comfortable sounds of a family settling in for the night. "We should get her inside," Donovan said eventually. "Don't want her catching cold." They carried Grace back into the warm kitchen, where the fire crackled merrily in the hearth and the smell of the ham Samuel had been cooking all day filled the air. Tomorrow they'd have their first Christmas as a family, with presents Samuel had carved and a feast Donovan had helped prepare. As they tucked Grace in her cradle, she opened her eyes and looked up at both of them with the perfect trust that had transformed two broken men into something whole. "Papa Sam," she whispered, then turned her head. "Papa Marcus." Her eyes drifted closed again, and she slept the peaceful sleep of a child who knew she was loved beyond measure. Samuel and Donovan stood over her cradle, two men who'd learned that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about choice. Sometimes it was about second chances and shared purpose and the willingness to love something more than your own pride. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the desert in quiet grace. And inside the small adobe house that had once echoed with loneliness, three hearts beat in rhythm with something larger than themselves. The desert had given up its secret after all, that love, like water in a drought, always found a way to flow where it was needed most.